Okay, I just wanted to first say thank you to everyone who started to join us so far. Today we are doing an author talk with author Esther Amini, and we're going to be discussing her debut memoir, Concealed. So thank you for everyone for attending. I would just like to say a couple things first that we will do a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So, any questions or anything like that, you can put throughout while you think of them in the Q&A, but we will get to them at the end. So if you have any questions that come up, you can save them to the end, or, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will get to them later. And I will share them with Esther and we'll discuss those at the end. You can also feel free to use the chat for any comments or questions, or also at the end, you can raise the hand feature on Zoom as well at the bottom. So, any of those features that you're comfortable with, we'll get to those questions at the end. So just wanted to say that, a little bit of housekeeping. But like I said, thank you so much for joining the East Hampton Library for this program. Like I said, we're joined by Esther Amini, who is a writer, painter, and psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice. Her recently released book entitled Concealed, which we're talking about today, is her debut memoir. Kirkus Review selected and anointed Concealed one of the best books of 2020. Esther Amini's short stories have appeared in Elle, Lilith, Tablet, The Jewish Week, Bernard Magazine, TK University's Inscape Literary, Proximity, Paper Brigade, and Libby Owen's anthology, Moms Don't Have Time To. She was named one of Aspen Word's Best Emerging Memoirist and awarded its Emerging Writer Fellowship in 2016 based on her memoir entitled Concealed. Her pieces have been performed by Jewish Women's Theater in Los Angeles and in Manhattan, and was chosen by JWT as their artist in resident in 2019. High Flicks, Jewish Netflix, is presently streaming an excerpt from Concealed called Amrika, if I'm pronouncing that right. So again, just thank you so much, Esther, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course. And, if you would like to, we would love to just, start this talk off, if you could possibly give us a small summary of your memoir.
Of course. Concealed is about me. It's my story. It's a memoir. Here I am caught between two opposing cultures. I'm the American-born daughter of Jewish Persian parents who fled Iran right after World War II. So this was in 1946, way before the Khomeini Revolution, over 30 years before the Khomeini Revolution. And my parents came from the Iranian city of Mashhad. Mashhad is the most fanatically religious city in all of Iran. It's a Shiite stronghold, a pilgrimage site with a long history of maiming and massacring infidels. And an infidel is anyone who is not Muslim. So my parents, along with their community, lived as crypto Jews, hidden Jews. And this goes back generations. And they pretended to be other than who they were. They pretended to be Muslims. So that's the background. They came to the United States after World War II. A few years later, I was born. And they brought with them the belief system, the values of Mashhad. So I'm caught at the intersection of two opposing cultures. Here I am growing up as an American, I being the youngest in the family and the only daughter. My parents had my two brothers who were very young when they arrived here, but I was the only one born in this country and the only daughter. Mm. And I'm attending public school, which we'll get into later. My mother was never schooled. Girls in Mashhad were kept illiterate. Mm-hmm. And here in America, I'm expected to learn to read and write. Mm-hmm. And how to navigate between two opposing parents. My parents were diametric opposites, and two cultures that seemed to clash.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's the summary of the book. There's a lot of humor in it. It's not just dark and gray, but there's a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication. again, these two countries don't really understand each other.
Right.
My two parents really didn't understand each other.
Right.
And so, there are these comedic moments that I had to include. And that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing. I wish I said to you beforehand, but I love this memoir and it was really great. So, we'll talk about at the end, where you can get Esther's book. But if you haven't read it yet, it's a must read. And like she said, it definitely, at least for me, it combined that it was like very serious, but also like very funny. And there was like very like light moments and, I think moments that, remind me of my own family or maybe like anyone's family, like what it feels like to have siblings and, parents and fighting and all those sorts of things. So I really enjoyed it. Okay. So, we're going to get into a couple of questions here that, I'm really excited to ask you and to hear more about the memoir. But first off, I would like to just ask, why did you, first, decide to write this memoir? Why did you write a book? If you could possibly share a little bit of that sort of like writing experience and, what, got you to that place where here you are, publishing this book about yourself.
Right. Well, I come from a long legacy of concealment. Of silence, of not telling one's story. My mother, for example, as I said, was illiterate, so she couldn't read or write. And the men from the city of Mashhad, again, this is within this Jewish community, the men were certainly not going to write in a journal or keep a diary and become transparent when they're pretending to be other than who they are. Again, this went on for generations. So there is no firsthand account of what it was like to be a crypto Jew in the city of Mashhad. And for good reasons, there is no firsthand account. You might get historical facts where some say what happened historically, but not what personally a person was experiencing, feeling, dreading, aspiring towards, how they handled this duality, this duplicity. That you don't really have on paper.
Right.
And so I'm really the bridge between my parents who lived it, came here to New York, and my mother shared a lot of her stories. My father was reluctant to talk, but I was able to squeeze some facts out of him. And then I felt it was very important to write this because I kind of wanted to resurrect their history, to rescue them from obscurity. I wanted to break the silence. I wanted to defy Mashhad, which pretty much was saying you dare not tell this story, to give voice to those who didn't have a voice, and also to thread the Jewish Mashhadi story into the larger tapestry. They were another community that lived risking their lives, always dreading, always paranoid. Every time they stepped out of the house, they could have been killed for who they really were. How they managed doing that, generation after generation, why they didn't leave, why they stayed, why that became home, even though it was torturous. And then the impact on me, of course, here growing up in the United States, wanting to be like every other typical girl, growing up in the States, going to public school, having girlfriends, and there's this overlay of Mashhad on top of me. Do's and don'ts coming out of the home, which really go back to medieval Mashhad. And I am growing up in 20th century America. And how to navigate, how to balance, how to hold on to family and hold on to myself. I thought it was an important story. On the one hand, it's very specific and idiosyncratic. And on the other hand, I think it really offers universal themes that many people can identify with.
Right.
So I felt really compelled to put this down on paper.
Right. Just, it made me think of, you mentioned sort of, being this voice, giving a voice to the voiceless, do you feel like you gave that voice and, possibly, were writing something that someone maybe like your mom who was illiterate, would have liked to write if they were literate or had those same opportunities, maybe being second generation or something like that, like, did you feel that, did you think about someone like your mom, who, at least in the memoir has such a voice, and things has such stories to tell, can you imagine, her wishing or would have wanted to write this story for herself if she could?
Absolutely, no question about it. My mother was outgoing, outspoken, rebellious, defiant, irreverent. And if she could have, she would have.
Right.
And she would have written it the way it was.
Right.
And my father was the exact opposite. He was very withdrawn, a man of silence, a man who sanctified silence, and a man who feared speech, who feared interactions, partly because of his life in Mashhad, partly because of the way he was raised by his father.
Mm-hmm.
I get into all of that in the book. And so he forbade speech in the home, and my mother would defy him and override him and speak even more and louder. And so you're right. I mean, she certainly, if she could, she would have.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a part of me thinking of her and channeling her as I was writing. Yes.
Yeah. She's such a character. I loved hearing about your mom. Continuing to, talk about the sort of like writing process, I just feel like the title Concealed, is powerful and definitely packs a punch, is there a reason or was there inspiration between, yes, there it is. Was there sort of a reason, between why like you chose that title or, what inspired that choice?
Yeah, I felt it was an important title. It references certainly my parents and my ancestors who had to conceal themselves. My mother would wear the black chador, which is the burqa, a black drape from head to toe when she stepped out of the house, and she would look through these eye slits, and she looked like all the other Muslim women. And she was concealing her true identity. And my father would pray from the Quran in public squares 5 times a day alongside other Muslims, pretending to be other than who he was.
Right.
And so that duplicity, that concealment became part of their character. And so they came here and I suddenly found myself concealing myself in a different way. I had to conceal my dreams, my thoughts, my wishes, my aspirations, because they weren't in sync with the Mashhadi culture that my father had come from. And so they weren't aligned with what he wanted for his daughter. And so the concealment continued, but in another form. And how it transferred from one generation to another,
right,
took on a different shape.
Right.
So that was the reason for the word concealed.
Concealed, right. Just continuing on, with that inspiration and, we've already spoken about it, but, like silence is huge and is such a huge, theme and aspect of the book, like for you, for your parents, for your father. I feel like it really resonates throughout the pages. It continues from, I feel like the first page to the last, it continued to coming up and like how that affected you. How do you feel that this, issue or a theme of silence has, played a role in your life and how it played a role in writing this memoir?
I think the need to be silent in the home. This was a dictate from my father. My mother certainly was not silent, but when he was home, he insisted that we not speak. And he was not a man who believed that words would lead to anything good. Because that's what he experienced. Experienced in the city of Mashhad a lot of turmoil and persecution, and every word had to be measured, and it was better not to speak than to speak. And so, understanding that now I understand my whole story very differently. Of course, as a child, I didn't know
Right.
anything. I didn't know what
Right.
we had to be quiet. We had to be
Mhm.
silent. I had to tiptoe through the house. He was against books because books have words and books talk. And
Mhm.
and I was very interested in reading. And so I was
Mhm.
hiding my books and I was reading under the covers in bed with a flashlight. Um, so this whole experience of having to conceal and to read in secret and
Mhm.
feeling that I am a criminal,
Mhm.
I did feel like an outlaw when I was reading.
Mhm.
Definitely shaped me. On the one hand, it made me want to read more. Of course, you always want to do what you're not supposed to.
Right.
It made that sin rather sweet.
Mm.
Uh, I also turned to painting at a very young age.
Mm.
I'll read a passage from the book that
Absolutely.
relates to silence, and this way
Absolutely.
you can also hear a passage this way. Uh,
Absolutely.
Silence took root in me, and my need for solitude grew. On my 8th birthday, my eldest brother Albert bought me an easel, palette knife, canvas boards, and tubes of Grumbacher oil paint. From then on, I spent Sundays in my room with alizarin crimson, burnt umber, Indian yellow, and phthalo blue. After mixing fleshy heaps of pigment, I'd scoop, fling, and scrape, leaving behind mom, pop, PS99, and any need for friends. I sailed into zones of shrieking colors that couldn't be heard by anyone other than me. Each you had a breath, pulse, and tongue of its own. In this soundless space, my paints spoke loudly, and I listened intently, dabbling in portraits and landscapes, but preferring to lose myself in blissful, freedom-finding abstracts. I discovered I didn't want to put the world into words, that not every sensation had a matching name. Not every image or impulse could be explained. I began to believe that spoken language was artificial, formulaic, forcing me to shoehorn feelings into sentences while losing so much in translation. I preferred the primal feel of paint, paint that sang, cried, and killed, paint that said, I'm not rational, not civilized, not neatened up. I'm straight from the gut, muddy and messy. You can't tell me who I am. I'll tell you. I studied hard, did well in school, but struggled with an undisclosed secret. Words did not come easily. They
Mm.
came out backwards, in the wrong order, haltingly. I had to fight hard to retrieve a word, to verbalize thought, to translate flutters of feeling into language. My innards had potholes that swallowed up nouns, verbs, and adjectives before I could reach them. Words felt like little rebels, fugitives on the run, each with a warring will of its own. They made their own decisions, whether to stay or scram, help me self-express or leave me tongue-tied. And so I thought and spoke in shades of color.
Mm. Thank you. Wow. Do you still paint today?
I do.
You do. What do you paint?
A lot of the images are organic shapes,
Mm.
and I really try to reach into the preconscious and get
Mm.
into feelings that are rather primal. And
Mm.
I use oil paint,
Mm.
and they're abstract, but they're organic looking and three-dimensional.
Mm-hmm. I thought that passage was so, interesting when I first read it. And even now, I feel like maybe this dichotomy of like painting and, like the words coming hard and at the same time, like your head's always in a book and you're reading and you're like desperate for the words. And I just found that, really interesting, and sort of this like, I don't know if battle between the two, but you sort of like bring them together, and it seems so I don't know, like kind of like warring feelings a little bit. And I guess I'm also wondering, was there certain, because you just shared about like painting and sort of like what that meant, you know, those who have read it or who haven't read it, that last line when you talk about, reading, and, your dad was right, books in the hands of a woman were dangerous. I really liked that. And I guess I'm wondering, are there certain, like works or certain, like books or authors that you feel like, really like shaped you, or, found you at important moments, whether that was like younger, whether that was like older when you felt like you had more of a voice, are there certain like texts that you come back to where you feel like really defined that period of your life?
I was so fascinated by books that it really
Mm-hmm.
didn't matter. It was whatever I was reading, I was kind of
Mm-hmm.
searching for a piece of myself in that book, uh,
Mm,
a piece of my internal self, uh, trying to identify with the feels. I remember reading Black Beauty
mm,
and I read that over and over and over again. Uh, and I was just in awe. I was in awe of the story, of the feelings, um, and that it was taking me out of my world. And could I identify? And was there any part of me in that book? And
mm,
then Five Little Peppers and How They Grew. And that was another book that I read over and over again.
mm-hmm.
Uh, all of this eventually led to, I remember reading J.D. Salinger as a young adolescent, Catcher in the Rye.
Mm-hmm.
And I was blown away because I didn't know that one could express oneself that way, that
Mm-hmm.
had the freedom to speak that way. And given that I came from a home where I certainly didn't have the freedom
Right.
to speak that way. So I think books in general were giving me the license
Mm,
to find my own words
mm-hmm.
and to figure out who I am. And that's a process, of course. It's a lifelong process. But
Yeah.
who I was as a pre-adolescent, who I was as a teenager, who I was as a young adult, and we changed. Um, it was very important. It was very affirming
Mm,
that if you feel different, which I felt like an
mm,
outsider. I didn't know anyone who had parents like mine,
mm,
and to try to find others who felt like outsiders, who felt different.
mm,
What could they do with their difference? And what could I do that would be productive and constructive with my difference?
mm-hmm.
These are thoughts I started to have during adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
But, I often feel like I often felt that I was falling and books were catching me.
Yeah.
I felt caught and held by books.
Yeah. And another thing that I, really enjoyed on that same, topic was, I'm forgetting your friend's name, but when you were younger and, her mom was a teacher, a professor or something, an academic, and kind of this, you would like swap, she was giving you like her mom's academic books and you were giving her, I don't know if it was like comic books or something like that, and I really enjoyed that because I felt like, even at the time in your writing where, you were seeking those more, academic things, I feel like it really like highlighted the breadth of, like literature or, like art in that way that, like different people are seeking different things, and, something like a classic or a Salinger versus, a graphic novel, like there was a place for it all. And I felt like that was represented throughout your memoir, which I really enjoyed, like the different points of our life, like what were we reading or what were we, needing at that point, and how they're all equally important. At least it's, I took that from that. So I really enjoyed that.
Right.
Um, so continuing on with sort of concealment and silence, I'd love for you if you could talk a little bit about how this, shaped you, specifically in your life, but specifically, in your profession. So, as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice, how did this, not just personally, but how do you feel like this, concealment and silence led to you choosing this profession?
Well, I was always a very quiet child, and I think I was an easy child. I was deferential and respectful and watching and listening a lot and trying to make sense out of chaos. My parents never agreed over anything. My father really despised America. My mother adored America. And so it felt like symbols were clashing constantly.
Right.
And I think I just became more introverted, more introspective, more of a thinker and a watcher, and wanting, and I loved my parents, but I wanted to understand why they were behaving the way they were. Like I was always confused.
Right.
And so the book, you hear the voice of the child. It's through the voice of a 3, 4, 5-year-old, and then later a 7, 8, 9-year-old, and later a teenager. And my understanding of them evolves because I'm cognitively growing and beginning to understand there is a backstory. And during my adolescence, I really wanted to understand who they were and where they came from and what they endured. And so I became very inquisitive. And I was always aware that people are complex and there is so much going on at once. And it's wrong to simplify them, into good and bad. That there's a multitude of selves inside, and they each have a story.
Right.
And I think I became very aware of that at a rather young age. So my fascination with human beings and my respect for their ability to cope, survive, somehow adapt to circumstances that are very difficult to adapt to. I found myself really experiencing a great deal of reverence for the human race and really wanting to understand the psyche more and more. And so
right.
a natural leaning, I just, I was an art history major in college, and that's so different. It's not so different from being a therapist because you're looking at voiceless objects, paintings, sculptures, and giving it meaning, finding words to explain it, decoding the body language, the position of the composition, the use of space, and decoding it and giving it words. And then when you're with patients, you're also helping them do that, to be able to attach language to whatever they're experiencing. And once you start using language and it becomes an accurate representation of what's going on inside, that's already partly the mastery. You're mastering those impulses, when you feel flooded and everything is chaotic, that it begins to feel very dangerous.
Right.
So I think coming from a place of silence has been very, very productive for me. There was pain as a child, but there was gain later on. And I was able to also, I think, feel a great deal of empathy for people who are having trouble understanding themselves and those around them.
Right.
And have trouble putting it into words.
Right. You briefly mentioned before, just sort of like, the flow of the book, this was you at, 5 to 7, 9, a teenager, I guess I'm wondering, what really, pushed along that timeline and, like when writing the book, because it definitely is chronological, but then you also, jump back, right? You're like reflecting on, your mom's story again, and that takes you back to here, reflecting on this situation, or, you're telling a story again when you were a child. So I guess I'm wondering, was that, just a natural process and that's the way it came about? Or did you have a specific timeline in general when you were writing it?
Well, I was working on this book for 5 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's part of the answer. I first
Right.
wanted to get it all out. And
Yeah.
then the question became like, what comes first, what comes second?
Right.
And I didn't want to do it purely chronologically, because if I did, the first half of the book would be about my parents and their
Right.
lives. And I'm not in there yet.
Right.
And the reader might feel discouraged and not want to continue reading.
Right.
It is a memoir. And so the question was how to thread myself in and somehow have them and then me and them and then me, and what are
Mhm.
the links, and where does one story lead into another story? How does my mother's story of being born, when she was born, her parents died, and so she was an orphan. Her mother died giving birth to her.
Right.
She always felt she killed her mother. And her father died when she was 2 years old, and so she had zero memory. And so the whole idea of her orphanage and how that shaped her, and then in what way did she mother me, and what was her expectation from me, which was to be her mother, because she named me Esther, and her mother was Esther, the mother that she never saw or knew.
Right.
So it became one in which I had to think more deeply about where do we crisscross, and how can we all be in it at the same time? At times only me, at times only them, but for the most part, we're enmeshed. And
Right.
that's until I go off to college. And then, of course, it's about me. So I reworked the order a number of times, and every time I was writing, I would have another memory, and memories started to surface,
Right.
memories that I had conveniently buried for 30, 40 years were suddenly coming up, which is very
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, that's part of the writing process also.
Mm.
Um, when you write about yourself and you're digging deep, it is an archaeological dig. And all of a sudden, there are these bones that you discover,
Yeah.
forgotten. And then those memories turned into a story, and then that became
Yeah.
a whole memory. So part of it was very organic, no question.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
question was, what should the order be? And I wanted it to be engaging and to be fluid,
Mm.
and have the humor and the pathos, and for it not to have just one flavor.
Right. And I feel like that even just starts to answer, another question that I had, just about like the moments and, the memories, like you said, like you were writing and, things just emerged and those memories led to other stories and other memories, besides that coming up, was there specific, like moments of your life that you started this saying, I want to write about this, like this is important, I want to write about this memory, because, I guess I'm interested in, there's such personal anecdotes about specific, things in your life, like were some plans, like you knew you wanted to write about this versus that, how did you edit that? How did you narrow that down? What would go in? Because we all have, hundreds and thousands of moments and memories in our lives. Like, what was that choice process?
Yeah. Well, when I began, I just knew I had a story that
Mm.
had never been told.
Right.
And so that was propelling me. And
Right.
I knew that I believed that no one had parents like mine.
Right.
Because you've read the book, Rebecca, I think you can agree that they were extremes in
Yeah.
many, many ways.
Hmm.
And I also felt that their story, my story, has never been told, needs to be told. And in some way, I felt it would also speak to others. I wasn't quite sure how.
Mm.
I didn't say to myself, oh, there is this story, and let me start here. I
Right.
just allowed it to come. Like what
Right.
is going to come first should come. So that Oscar de la Renta story, where my mother decides she's going to bluff her way in and buy Oscar de la Renta gowns wholesale and pretend she owns a boutique in Tehran. And meanwhile, she lives in Queens and can't read and did not have any mathematical skills, and there was no boutique. And the way she was a con artist in that story, the way she conned her way through was certainly a story I remembered vividly. And I said,
Right.
this is a wild story. I think I should really start with this. So I started with that one.
Right.
And then they started to flow. It was one after another.
Right.
It was about giving myself permission to let it out
Right.
and not censor myself.
Yeah. The dress snippet was one of my favorite from the book. It's so wild. You talk about, wanting, feeling like it's a story that hasn't been told before, like wanting to reach people, the memoir so far is, like critically acclaimed, it's had so much international recognition, like how were you expecting that? How do you feel about that? Why do you think it's, reaching people, you wanted it to, but were you expecting that?
I was not expecting that.
Hmm.
It has been very warmly received
Yes.
internationally, and highly praised, and I'm so grateful for that. But I am surprised. And so I have been spending time trying to understand how people are identifying with these characters who are so eccentric and so different. And so in my case, my parents were incongruous. There was a lot of misunderstanding and I don't know. For example, my father did not want me to do well in school. So here I was forging his signature ever since I was in kindergarten all the way through school because I was a straight A student. And if he found out, he would have been horrified. And so I didn't know other children that were hiding their report cards because they were doing well. I knew they were hiding their report cards because they were failing.
Right.
Maybe forging. So I felt like everything about me and my life felt so different from others.
Right.
And yet the world has welcomed this book and embraced it. And I think I think it has many reasons. I think one, it is a story that's never been told. I think it's been told well. And also, people are very curious about Iran. Iran is on the front page of the newspapers every day.
Right.
And what is that country about? What are those people about? And then within that country, you have these crypto Jews hiding in the city of Mashhad.
Yeah.
Generations dating back 2,700 years, going back to Persia. And how did they subsist? I think all of that. But something more primal, I think, the basic skeletal structure of the book is what happens when one doesn't fit into the paradigm of one's own family. And I didn't fit into the paradigm of my family. And I think many people can identify with that.
Feel that, right.
And what do you do? In my case, it was an invitation for more. It was an invitation for growth. It was an invitation to flex my muscles and try to do it carefully and not alienate my family, and at the same time, not alienate myself from me.
Right.
And it was a struggle to incorporate all these different parts of myself. I also have parts of myself that feel very Persian because I did grow up in a Persian home.
Right.
And very American. And to allow them to live side by side, and they don't have to mesh. They don't have to melt into one another. They can live side by side.
Yeah.
And I think that first generation American drive was very much in me. And the wish to follow the grain in my wood finally came out. And I think people can identify with that.
Right.
They don't have to be Jewish. They don't have to be Iranian. They don't have to be female.
Right.
To understand that struggle.
Right. Jumping, back a little bit, speaking about, what your father expected of you, or like what your mother wanted for you, I feel like, especially in the beginning, there's so many expectations, right? Like there's constantly like people are expecting different things for you. You're expected to be a certain type of person, a certain type of woman. And in the beginning of the book, you sort of bring up this idea that you felt like you owed your parents something, or you owed your family something. You also talked about, which I thought was really interesting, like feeling like you owed your brothers something and the role that they played, sort of that, standing, in front of you, sort of maybe that barrier, opening different parts of the world to you. And I guess I'm wondering, what really triggered that feeling of, was there specific elements of their past? And, you even talked about like your brothers being born there, and was there something about that, or what specific aspects of their past did you feel like made you feel guilty and made you feel like you owed them something?
Well, I'm hoping viewers will read the book because it's hard to condense down to one sentence.
Yeah.
But my brother David was a toddler in Iran attending a private school, a nursery school. And
Right.
the Muslim teacher took a poker, stuck it into the fireplace, heated the poker, and pressed it against his earlobe. And he was about 2, 3 years old at the time.
Right.
A dirty Jew. And he came home with a swollen, bloody, pussy earlobe, crying bloody murder. And that was the trigger. That was what my mother, that was when my mother said,
Yeah.
we're leaving this country.
Right.
So it was his earlobe that was symbolic. I mean, I heard the story 100 times. And how my brother Albert, who's the eldest, also suffered. And there was another incident when they were driving to the city of Hamadan, where my mother wanted to pray for a daughter.
Right.
And, she had 2 boys. She wanted a daughter. She wanted to name her Esther after the mother she never knew. And Queen Esther was buried in the city of Hamadan, and they're driving there, and there is this huge accident, which I won't get into, but it affected my brother Albert. And it was all with the intentions of praying for a daughter and then leaving the country and coming to America.
Right.
So they had been scarred in so many different ways. Certainly there was persecution. They always lived in fear of their lives because they were Jewish. And then there were these individual stories as to what happened to each person on their way to leave. And to leave to come to New York, where I was going to be born. And I didn't have their crises, their tragedies, their horrors.
Right.
And if they hadn't gone through all of that and hadn't decided quite heroically to leave, because they had a very comfortable life. And again, it wasn't, the Khomeini revolution had not begun. That took place 30 plus years later. So financially, they were doing well and they were comfortable in their conditions. They had grown used to their life. But it was my mother who said, enough is enough. And if all of that hadn't happened, I would have been raised behind a black chador, behind a burqa in the city of Mashhad, and not allowed to enter a classroom and kept illiterate. So there was a feeling of I owe. I owe my mother, my father, my brothers, big time.
Yeah.
And my brothers played a very important role in the United States, and I wrote a lot about them. They wanted to give me the opportunities they had and be exposed to the worlds that they were being exposed to. And so I stood on their shoulders and reached the sky, and a lot of it had to do with them. There was a feeling of indebtedness for sure.
Right. You just spoke about, some of, the issues or some of their trials or, crises, dealt with the fact that they were, Jewish in hiding, and that how the persecution that, your brothers dealt with and your parents. And, there are some, I encourage obviously everyone to read it if you haven't. You talk about some situations and some stories where your parents, encountered, maybe some, unwelcome situations, even in New York, for not being the right type of Jewish. And I guess I'm wondering, without being able to speak on their circumstances, but your own, how did you feel, and what was your experience being an Iranian Jew in New York, in your community? Did you feel a part of that larger Jewish community? Did you feel included? Did you feel that you could be, proud of your Jewishness in the community that you were in?
The answer is yes. To all of the above. My parents always went to Ashkenazi synagogues. These are synagogues that were run by European Jews.
Right.
And back in the early 1950s, living in Kew Gardens, Queens, that's what there was.
Right.
There weren't other options. Today, there are synagogues that are run by the Mizrahi Jews, and the Mizrahis are those who come from the Middle East, and Sephardic Jews who came from Spain originally, and Ashkenazi. But back then, there weren't those choices.
Right.
And so we went to the Ashkenazi synagogues, and we included ourselves. I always felt that they didn't, there was a particular synagogue that did not treat the Persian Jews as if they were the real deal.
Yeah.
There was this feeling, again, in the 1950s, those who came from Eastern Europe were authentically Jewish,
Right.
and everyone else wasn't really. Of course, the thoughts and feelings have changed since then. But, I did feel that, but I didn't want to feel it. And so I think I denied a lot of it, even though it was present.
Right. Thank you so much for answering those questions. I do want to, I see we have some already in the Q&A. I want to leave some time for everybody to answer their questions. So I'm going to look at these and talk about some of these questions that you guys already put in. But anyone else, if any other questions come up, please put them in the Q&A or chat now. Sorry, let me just open these up. We have a comment from Max. I can really relate to the author. My mother was Irish, not Iranian, but she and my grandparents were always very secretive, even to this present day. It brought home a book to the dinner table, rutabaga stories, and father threw it out the window, right onto 14th Street. And let's just see here. Max also says that, you mentioned Salinger, what were your thoughts about his writing, because you mentioned sort of his influence, or really, Catcher in the Rye, do you feel like it's held up over time, or, some of his, experiences during the war, do you still feel like he had an impact on your writing, and did your, feelings about him as an author, has it, continued with you, I guess, is what he's asking.
Well, I haven't gone back and read Catcher in the Rye for quite a while, and many, many decades. I remember reading Catcher in the Rye when I was a young teenager, maybe 14, 15 years old, and in awe, because it addressed what adolescence is feeling. And there I was, going through all sorts of doubts and questions, and not knowing whether I should really revere the adult world or punch holes in it. And I did see their flaws, and I did see their deficits, and Salinger would go for it all the way, and so it spoke to me. It spoke to that girl who was feeling suspicious of the outside world, and feeling suspicious of the adult world, the adult world, which is what he plays with a lot. So I didn't go back and read some of it, and I'm sure I would
Yeah.
have a very different feeling today. I don't think I would
Yeah.
have a feeling because I'm no longer 13,
Right.
and so I can't really say how I would feel today.
Right. Another question, which is a large question, I'm not sure exactly how much you can answer, but it does sort of play into a question that I was wondering about sort of, the background of, like historical research that you might have needed to do in Iran's history and sort of, not being there. And what did you have to do, for the book? Someone's just wondering, again, I'm not sure how much you can answer it, but, what's this history, behind the enmity in Iran against the Jewish community? And, does this go back, a long time? You spoke a little bit about, the Jewish situation there, but, what's, did you know that history growing up, a little bit of why there was that, conflict of being Jewish in Iran, or, why that stretched back so far?
Well, I'm not a historian,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so I'm not going to pretend to be one. I can just say that during adolescence, I started doing a lot of research, and I was reading up, and I learned that the anti-Semitism ran deep and went back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Right.
Partly it's because that culture had zero tolerance for anyone who was different.
Right.
They treated Christians the same way, and they treated Zoroastrians the same way,
Mm-hmm.
those who were Baha'i the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there wasn't room for difference. Um, there were periods and cities where it was easier
Mm-hmm.
yourself to some degree, but the
Right.
Mashhad was not one of them. The city of Mashhad, again, is the holiest city in all of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
The 9th century Imam Reza is buried there. It's a pilgrimage site. Millions of people come from around the world to pay homage to Imam Reza. And so it's fanatical. And yet, that's where my family lived. That's where my ancestors lived. So I think partly you have to look at each city and the story of each city, because Tehran
Right.
was much more sophisticated. Tehran was more cosmopolitan. Mashhad was medieval.
Mm-hmm. Now, this question's coming from not a ton of personal knowledge of my own, knowing, there's a lot of travel restrictions in that area a lot of the time. So I'm not assuming that you haven't been, but if you haven't been there, or, have been able to ever visit or travel, has it been something that you've ever desired, that being your family's, home, has it, or, if you have, had the chance to go there? I'm not sure how open it is for US citizens. So, or if you've ever had the desire.
It would be dangerous for me to go. So
It would.
I haven't been, and I would love to go.
You would. Okay.
And I regret the fact that when my father used to go back and forth during my adolescence, he would always say, "Would you like to come with me?" And I would think,
Right.
for me, it was like some third world country that
Right.
I would have no interest in, and I would rather go to Europe or South America. I mean, I had
Right.
places. Iran was not on the list,
Right.
and I'm very sorry I didn't take him up on it, because I today would love to go. I feel that a part of me is there and comes from there, and I
Right.
want to reunite and
Right.
integrate those parts with me. Um, but given that I have the last name Amini, which is a Persian name.
Right.
I'm Jewish and I've traveled to Israel, so Israel is stamped in my passport. And I'm female. If I entered the country and there is no US embassy that
Right. Right.
have no shelter,
Mm.
they would accuse me of being a spy, and they would just take me away. And so I wouldn't have any recourse.
Right.
So for me, it would be a dangerous thing to do.
Right.
I'm hoping within my lifetime things will change and I'll be able to step foot on that soil,
Mm.
visit, Mashhad and visit Isfahan, which is the artistic city,
Mm,
Shiraz, which is the poetic city, the city of literature and poetry, and visit Tehran. And I mean, I'd love to do all of that,
yeah,
but I think I'm just going to have to wait and see.
right. Um, I don't see any more questions right now in the Q&A or chat. I just wanted to give everyone another minute or so. Did anyone else have any further questions for Esther or anything that you wanted to share? Again, you can type it in the Q&A or put it in the chat or raise your hand. Anything else that anyone wanted to ask? Okay. We still have another minute or two. So if you think of something, quickly type it in or raise your hand. I just want to say thank you so much to Esther. Like I said, this is, Concealed, her debut memoir. I am going to drop the Amazon link to this book in the chat so that you can all, that's the cover. And again, my huge recommendation, I'm going to drop it in the chat for everybody to see. The Amazon link so you can know where to buy it. We also have it at the library if you're local and want to come get it. Hold on, let's see if that works. Okay, perfect. If you've enjoyed this talk or just, would like to read the book or, love to support Esther, it's always really appreciated, to go on, read the book, purchase the book, rated 5 stars, all those good things to just, support authors that we care about. So those are always important things. Check out that link if you are interested in. We have a couple more just things in the chat.
Well, I see a question. Do you have children and how did they feel?
Yes. Yes.
We do. We have 2 children, a son and a daughter. They're both grown up, married, have children of their own. And they were thrilled. I mean, they knew I was working on this book for many years and I would call them to read it because it was changing. It was constantly changing. And so I want you to see the finished product. And finally, when the book came out and was published, I handed them a hard copy. And they just ran home to their individual homes, devoured the book, came back and just told me how much they loved it. They just felt, not only did they enjoy reading it, but they felt that it was something that they could hand to their children and to their grandchildren and to pass on a story that was very, very personal, but also universal.
Right. We have comments saying they enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Again, everybody, I just wanted to say thank you to all our attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, please read the book. Please check it out on Amazon. Thank you so much for attending. Esther, thank you so much for being so gracious in your time, reading us an excerpt, answering all our questions. We really appreciate it. It's really just been a pleasure to speak with you and discuss the book after having read it and loved it so much. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, everybody. Just have a safe night. Have a good night, everybody. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, Esther. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.